A parade that never came. In the summer of 1953, a young man stepped off a bus in a small town in Ohio. He was wearing his army uniform, the one he had been issued before shipping out to a peninsula on the other side of the world that most Americans could not have located on a map when he left, and could not locate on a map now that he was back. He had been gone for 14 months. He had seen things that he had no language for, in a country whose name he still sometimes mispronounced. No one met him at the bus stop. There was no crowd. There was no banner. There was a gas station across the street and a diner 2 blocks down, and the particular silence of an American town on a Tuesday afternoon in July. The silence of a place where life had continued, uninterrupted, while he was gone. He walked home. His mother made dinner. His father asked if he wanted to watch television. Nobody asked about Korea. Nobody asked about Korea for the next 40 years. This is the story of the men who fought in the Korean War. The conflict that lasted from June 1950 to July 1953, that killed 36,574 Americans and wounded 103,284 more, that ended in an armistice that is technically still in effect today because no peace treaty has ever been signed. It is the story of what happened to those men when they came home. What they carried. What the country refused to carry with them. And what the silence cost, measured not in battles or territory, but in the interior lives of the men who survived a war that America decided, almost immediately, to forget. They called it the Forgotten War. The men who fought it had a different name for it. They called it their life. Act 1, the war that had no name. The legal designation matters more than it sounds. On June 27, 1950, President Harry S. Truman committed American military forces to the defense of South Korea following the North Korean invasion. He did not ask Congress for a declaration of war. He called it a police action, a phrase borrowed from the United Nations resolution that authorized the intervention, a phrase designed to signal limited commitment and international legitimacy, a phrase that would echo through the lives of the men who fought under it for the rest of their lives. A police action. Not a war. The men dying on the ridges above the Naktong River and in the frozen valleys of the Chosin Reservoir were not, officially, at war. They were participating in a police action. The bullets were real. The frostbite was real. The fear, the specific, animal terror of close combat in conditions of extreme cold and extreme numerical disadvantage, was real. The official designation was a fiction, and the men inside the fiction knew it, and the knowledge that the country they were fighting for could not bring itself to use the honest word for what it was asking them to do settled into them like cold into frozen ground. The Korean War began in the aftermath of World War II, in the administrative partition of a peninsula that had been a Japanese colony. The United States occupied the south, the Soviet Union the north, and the line between them, the 38th parallel, chosen for its rough geographic convenience, became, over 5 years, a border between 2 radically different political systems. On June 25, 1950, 90,000 soldiers of the North Korean People's Army crossed that line and swept south with a speed and ferocity that the American forces in the region, occupation troops, trained for peacetime administration rather than war, were entirely unprepared to meet. The early weeks of the war were a catastrophe. American and South Korean forces were driven to a shrinking perimeter around the port city of Pusan, the last toehold on the peninsula. Men dug in and held, sometimes with whatever they could find, sometimes with nothing but the refusal to retreat further. The Pusan perimeter held. MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950 reversed the tide. UN forces drove north. China intervened in October with an army that crossed the Yalu River in darkness and silence, and descended on the advancing UN columns with a ferocity and a scale that no one had prepared for. What followed? The winter retreat, the battles of the frozen Chosin, the grinding 2 more years of a war that settled, eventually, approximately where it had begun, produced a generation of American veterans who had experienced something that their country would spend the next 4 decades refusing to fully acknowledge. They came home to a country that had moved on. That had, in some important sense, never fully arrived at the war in the first place. Act 2, Chosin, the cold that never left. If there is a single event that concentrates the Korean War experience into its most essential elements, the physical extremity, the tactical disaster and tactical heroism, the institutional betrayal and individual courage, the wound that never fully healed, it is the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. November and December 1950. Approximately 15,000 United States Marines and soldiers, advancing toward the Yalu River in compliance with General Douglas MacArthur's orders, found themselves surrounded by an estimated 60,000 to 80,000 soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army in temperatures that dropped to 35 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The cold was not a backdrop. It was a weapon. It froze weapons. It froze blood in wounds before the wounds could be properly treated. It froze the morphine in the syringes that medics carried to treat the pain of men who needed something more than the frozen morphine could provide. The Marines called their 17-day fighting withdrawal to the port of Hungnam a breakout. Other people called it a retreat. The Marines, with the particular stubbornness of an organization that had built its identity around refusing certain words, insisted that it was in advance, in a different direction. Whatever you called it, it extracted from the men who made it a physical and psychological cost that no subsequent reassessment of its tactical significance has diminished. Private First Class Harold Mulhausen, a 19-year-old from rural Pennsylvania who had enlisted because the army had seemed, in the flat agricultural landscape of his hometown, like an exit, described the cold at Chosin in an oral history recorded in 1998, 48 years after the fact. In a voice still carrying the specific flatness of someone who has told a story so many times that the emotion has worn off its surface but not its interior. He said, "You stopped feeling it after a while? That was the dangerous part. When you stopped feeling it, you thought you were fine. You weren't fine. You were dying. The feeling had just gone somewhere else. The feeling went somewhere else and it stayed there." The men who walked out of Chosin, frostbitten, some of them missing fingers or toes or the tips of ears to the cold, all of them carrying the specific weight of having survived when others had not, carried the reservoir with them for the rest of their lives. Not as a story they told, necessarily. As a presence. As the thing that lived behind their eyes in the grocery store and the church pew and the Tuesday evening in the living room when nothing in particular was happening and the Chosin was happening anyway, in the interior landscape that civilian life had no coordinates for. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a diagnosis available to them. The DSM would not add PTSD until 1980, 27 years after the armistice, long after most of the men of Chosin had developed whatever coping strategies they were going to develop, which in many cases meant no coping strategies at all. What was available to them was the expectation, stated explicitly in some cases, implicit in all, that they would return to civilian life and resume it. That the war, whatever it had done to them, was finished, and that finished meant over, and that over meant gone. The war was not gone. The cold was not gone. For the men of Chosin and for the veterans of the Korean War more broadly, the war went on in the only theater left to it after the armistice, inside. Act 3, the silence they came home to. The contrast with World War II was not subtle, and it was not lost on the men who experienced it. The veterans of World War II had come home to ticker tape parades, to a nation that had organized itself around the war effort for 4 years, to a GI Bill that sent them to college and into the suburbs, to a cultural apparatus, the films, the newsreels, the novels, the memorials, that told them, clearly and repeatedly, that what they had done mattered and that the country knew it. The World War II veteran was the defining American figure of the post-war decade, honored, celebrated, integrated into the national story in ways that gave his service and narrative home. The Korean veteran came home to 1950s America, to a country enjoying the prosperity that the post-war boom had delivered, focused on television and automobiles and the anxious pleasures of suburban life, living under the shadow of the nuclear age in a way that made the small, distant, inconclusive war on the Korean peninsula feel like an interruption of the real story rather than a chapter in it. The World War II veteran had helped save civilization. The Korean veteran had, what, exactly? Maintained a line? Preserved a status quo? The armistice that ended the fighting restored the border approximately where it had been before the shooting started. The peninsula was divided. The war had cost 36,574 American lives and achieved, in the most reductive possible accounting, a draw. The country did not know what to do with a draw. American military culture, full stop, had no established language for the inconclusive, no ceremony for the restored status quo, no parade route that led from sacrifice to ambiguity. The veterans felt this. They felt it in the conversations that trailed off when Korea came up, in the way their experiences seemed to land in a different register from the World War II stories that their fathers and uncles told, in the specific, demoralizing sensation of having done something real and finding that the world around them could not quite bring itself to look at it directly. Many of them stopped trying to make it look. They put their uniforms in closets and their memories in compartments, and they got on with it, built careers, raised families, did what was expected of men of their generation and time, which was to be adequate to the demands of civilian life without making the civilian life uncomfortable by importing the war into it. The compartments held, for many of them, for decades. And then they didn't. The 1980s and 1990s saw a wave of late-onset psychological crises among Korean War veterans, men in their 50s, 60s, and 70s presenting to VA facilities and private therapists with symptoms that the clinical literature was finally beginning to have adequate language for. Intrusive memories. Hypervigilance. The inability to sleep through the night without the Chosin or the Naktong or the smell of a Korean winter coming back in forms that were more vivid than the room they were sleeping in. Marriages that had survived 40 years suddenly unable to survive the cracking of the compartment. The diagnosis, when it came, was often a double shock, the recognition that what they had been living with had a name, and the recognition that they had been living with it alone, without support, without acknowledgement, for 4 decades. The men of the Korean War had managed their war with the tools available to them: silence, stoicism, work, and the company of other men who understood without being told, and the management had cost them in ways that only became fully visible when the management broke down. Act 4. What the body kept. The physical consequences of the Korean War were visible in ways that the psychological ones were not, and even they received inadequate attention in the decades after the war. Frostbite, sustained at Chosin and in the winter fighting of 1950 and 1951, produces long-term damage to the peripheral nervous system, to circulation, to the tissues of fingers and toes and ears and noses that were damaged by cold and never fully recovered. The men who came home with frostbite injuries often found that the VA's understanding of the long-term sequelae was limited, that the connection between their current symptoms and their wartime injuries was difficult to establish through records that were incomplete, and that the burden of proof fell on them to demonstrate what their own bodies were telling them every day. The chemical and environmental exposures of the Korean War have received less public attention than the Agent Orange crisis that followed Vietnam, but they were real and their long-term consequences were significant. The use of pesticides, the exposure to burning materials in the course of combat operations, the water and food conditions of a war fought in a country that had been devastated by Japanese colonial rule and then by invasion. These produced health consequences that manifested over decades and that the veterans often struggled to connect, through the VA claims process, to their service. Sergeant Thomas Riley of the 7th Infantry Division came home in 1953 with frostbitten feet that had been treated in the field and pronounced healed. They were not healed. For the next 30 years, he experienced chronic pain in both feet that his civilian doctors attributed to various causes that did not include, because he had not mentioned it, and they had not asked, the winter he had spent in North Korea in 1950. It was not until a VA physician, conducting a routine review of his records in the mid-1980s, asked directly about his Korean service that the connection was made and the treatment was adjusted. 30 years. The gap between the wound and the treatment was 30 years, and it was filled, in large part, by the silence that the culture had imposed on the men who carried it. The body kept what the culture refused to acknowledge. It kept the cold and the noise and the fear in the only archive available to it, in the nervous system, in the sleep architecture, in the cardiovascular responses to stimuli that civilian life did not intend as threatening and that the veteran's nervous system could not stop interpreting as such. The body was still in Korea. The man attached to it was in Ohio, in the diner, on the Tuesday afternoon, trying to watch television. Act 5. The Long Wait for Recognition. The Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. was dedicated on July 27, 1995, 42 years after the armistice. 42 years. The men who stood at the dedication ceremony were in their 60s and 70s, and many of them wept, not only from pride or grief, but from the specific relief of something that had been withheld for so long finally being given. The memorial itself is remarkable. 19 stainless steel statues of soldiers on patrol, rendered in a realism so precise that they seem to have just stepped out of the Korean hills and into the Washington landscape. The Pool of Remembrance. The granite wall etched with the faces of 2,500 service members, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, who served in the war, their images ghostly and present simultaneously, the way the dead exist in the memories of those who survived them. The veterans who came to the dedication had been waiting more than 4 decades for something that the World War II veterans had received in months. The gap is not a footnote. It is the central fact of the Korean veteran experience. The wound that the war inflicted and the culture sustained, the specific injury of being asked to sacrifice without being offered the dignity of acknowledgement. Many did not live to see the memorial. The Korean War generation was aging. The youngest veterans were approaching 60 by the time the memorial was dedicated, and the 42 years of waiting had taken their toll in the ordinary arithmetic of mortality amplified by the specific costs that the war and its aftermath had imposed. The men who needed the acknowledgement most had often already died without it. The 70th anniversary commemorations of the Korean War, stretched across the early 2020s to mark the anniversary of the conflict's beginning, its major battles, and its armistice, offered another opportunity, belated but genuine, to give these men and the dwindling number who remained alive what had been withheld for so long. Ceremonies were held. Medals were presented to veterans who had waited decades for recognition that the paperwork had delayed, or the bureaucracy had misplaced, or the political will had not previously existed to deliver. But the 70th anniversary also arrived at a moment when the living veteran population of the Korean War had shrunk to a fraction of what it had been. The men who had fought at Chosin and Pusan and the Chosin River were in their 90s, most of them, and many had already died carrying their wars unacknowledged. The recognition arriving now was real and valuable and decades too late simultaneously, a combination that the veterans and their families received with a mixture of gratitude and grief that no ceremony was quite designed to hold. Act 6. The Sons and Daughters Left Behind. The consequences of the Korean veteran's silence did not stay inside the veteran. They moved, the way all unaddressed trauma moves, into the next generation. The children of Korean War veterans grew up in households shaped by presences they could not name. Fathers who were distant in a particular way, not absent, but somehow not entirely there, occupying the physical space of the family while some essential part of them remained elsewhere. Fathers who drank, in some cases, or who didn't drink but were rigid in ways that functioned similarly, creating around themselves a controlled environment that was a response to the uncontrolled environments they had survived. Fathers who flinched at loud noises, who couldn't sleep, who sat at dinner tables in the 1960s and 1970s somewhere between Ohio and the Chosin Reservoir. The clinical literature on secondary traumatization, on the transmission of trauma's effects from the person who experienced it to the people who live with that person, was not available to these families in the 1960s and 1970s. What was available was the experience itself, the father who couldn't be reached, the mother who had learned to navigate around a part of her husband that had no name, the children who understood instinctively that certain questions were not to be asked and certain silences were not to be broken. Many of these children grew up not knowing their fathers had fought in Korea. The war was not discussed. The service was not denied, the uniform in the closet, the discharge papers in the file cabinet were real, but it was not offered as a narrative, not worked into the family story, not given a place in the household's understanding of itself. The children of Korean veterans often discover the full scope of their father's service only after those fathers were dead, in the papers left behind, in the citations that had never been hung on walls, in the conversations that other veterans had at funerals and that revealed, for the first time, what the father had actually done and where he had actually been. These discoveries were complicated. Grief for a father recently lost. Grief for the relationship that might have been possible if the silence had been broken earlier. Anger at the culture that had made the silence seem necessary. Pride, genuine, complicated, arriving late, in a service that had been hidden not from shame but from a kind of protective instinct, the veteran's attempt to spare his family the weight of what he carried by carrying it alone. The weight had not been spared. It had been transmitted, differently, into the next generation. The silence had not protected anyone. It had only changed the shape of the damage. Epilogue: remember them now. There are fewer than 500,000 Korean War veterans still living in the United States, by current estimates. The number falls each year. The generation that fought this war, that went when called, that endured what the Chosin and the Naktong and the Chosin River demanded, that came home to a country that changed the channel, is in its final chapter. The time for the full accounting is now. Not after the last veteran is gone, when recognition becomes purely historical and the people who needed it most are no longer present to receive it. Now, while some of them remain. While some of them can still sit in a room and hear someone say, plainly and without qualification, that what they did was real, that it mattered, that the country knows, and that the country is sorry it took this long to say so. The Korean War was not a police action. It was a war. The men who fought it were not participants in a UN enforcement operation. They were soldiers, in the full meaning of that word, with everything the word carries, the courage and the fear, the brotherhood and the loss, the wounds that were visible and the wounds that were not. They deserved to come home to something more than a Tuesday afternoon in July and a town that didn't ask. They deserved the parade. They deserved the acknowledgement. They deserved a country willing to look at what it had asked of them and say, we see it. We know what it cost. We are grateful in a way that means something beyond a word. Some of them are still waiting. The rest have gone somewhere the recognition cannot reach. Remember them now. Say their names. Count their wars. Don't call it a police action.